humanities.
Humanities. And the main field of research is the modernization of the Muslim world in applying theories of world society, historical political sociology, and the sociology of knowledge. And the topic that he's going to discuss today is In Search of Social Order, Organized Modernity in the Thought of Hasan al-Banna and Mustafa Kamal Ataturk. When I first saw your topic, is wow, very interesting. It's distinguished between Hasan al-Banna as a hierarchy leader and Mustafa Kamal Ataturk, the one who, they say, saved Turkey from the fall after the abolishment of the caliphate. What is the legitimate social order for a modern state? Muslim state building projects answered these questions in a variety of ways. Political elites in Iran, Turkey, and Tunisia, for example, explicitly adopted secularist ideologies in shaping the national policies of their newly independent states. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led an iconoclastic revolution that stood in sharp contrast to the idea of an Islamic state promoted by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. This lecture compares the political ideologies of the Kemalist national movement and the Muslim Brotherhood, or Ikhwanul Muslimin, using a conceptual apparatus derived from theories of successive modernities. From this perspective, it argues that the political projects of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and Hasan al-Banna, which initially appeared to be diametrically opposed, nevertheless followed a similar and globally relevant model for a modernist social order. Without further ado, Professor Dietrich Jung.
Thank you very much for a nice introduction and for welcoming me and spending the morning together with me and listen to this topic, which many audiences puzzles. Because why Ataturk and Hasan al-Banna? And I think that they are, as individual political leaders, are actually ideal to discuss the question of how Islamic traditions can relate to political ideas and to the construction of social orders. When we ask what are the differences and the similarities in the thought of these two men, I would say nobody has a problem to find the differences. And I was educated already at school that I learned Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the only Muslim leader who has completely rejected religion, built up a secular state, and so on. So these classical narratives, where one could put a question mark. Even Ataturk defended the existence of Turkey in Lausanne and Inonu with the argument that the Muslims of Anatolia should have the right to self-determination. So there he actually took the religious card, vis-a-vis the war alliance and the war winners of the First World War. So it's not that this narrative is so easy and we should not just accept it. But for me personally, it's more interesting to look at similarities, because the differences are so obvious. It makes sense also to ask, are there also similarities? And I think, and this is in the title, the similarities we have to find in the historical period in which these men were active, and in which, for example, the American historian Robert Wiebe said, also in the United States and in Europe and in other parts of the world, this was the time in search of order, of social order. So political movements were looking what is the acceptable, adequate order for our people. And that is the first step to think about what could they have in common. Now, we actually should already have had this picture with Mustafa Kemal and Hasan al-Banna. I mean, Ataturk you could say, is a generation before Hasan al-Banna. But what you can say is that both, and I will come to that in their biographies, both are molded educationally and in their thought of Ottoman and Ottoman Egyptian modernism of the late 19th century. And they have combined an educational background in which Islam played a major role, but also for the first time, a kind of secular modern education played an equally important role. Hasan al-Banna himself, after having gotten an Islamic education, wanted to attend the official modern Egyptian school and said to his father, now this is the way I have to go. So they have similar backgrounds, but they develop their idea in very different contexts. And this is in what I want to go. We can go on with the slide. This is the program. The preparing live stream is above the program. But you see, more important is not that there is program, but what is the program? I will first tell you something about my key research interests and some autobiographical things, because you should know why I do what I do. Why does an originally South German who is in academic exile in Denmark present something about Islam and the Middle East in Malaysia? This is not the usual way to go normally, so you will hear something how I made this way. Then for me, there is no academic work without having a theoretical framework, and you should certainly know about that. So what are my theoretical premises? What is the concept of organized modernity, which is so prominent in the title? And then we go into first Hasan al-Banna and then Mustafa Kamal, and I draw some parallels, and I refer to the differences with respect to the context. Hasan al-Banna as a representative of the Egyptian Effendiya and the rise of a new middle class in Egypt, and Ataturk as an officer of the Ottoman army experiencing the demise of the Ottomans in, we have to say, joining the wrong side, namely the Germans in the First World War, and fighting along with Prussian officers. And my conclusion will be some reflections upon the question Islam and politics. So that's the program, and we can go on with the slide, and I show you something you might not know so much, because this is very German. As I was a small boy, the best thing what could happen is that I got the flu, I had not to go to school, and I was sitting at home and we're reading the novels of Karl May. Karl May was a German author who wrote most of his books in prison because he was had a fraud case, and he imagined two things. One thing is the Orient, the Arab world, wrote a book about Kurdistan and so on, and the other thing, American Indian and settlement in the United States. So he has two tracks of novels, which I, in following there, Edward Said would call, as a boy, my romantic Orientalism was fascinated by reading this. I was more on the side what is here, Kara Benemsi Effendi, which basically means the guy from Austria, the Effendi from Austria, and his assistant Haji Alef Omar. I loved these novels about North Africa and the Middle East, and so somehow I started to become interested in the region. And yes, I was also traveling the region, and then I was starting to study political science and Islamic studies at Hamburg University. I started to study Islamic studies, to be frank, not because I was interested in Islam. I did at that time not know much about Islam. But the interesting thing was I wanted to study Arabic. And at that time, we talk about the 1980s, when you wanted to study Arabic, at a German university, you had to study Islam because it was a part of Islamic studies, and Arabic was the auxiliary knowledge necessary to read the classics and so on. So this is the old philological tradition of Orientalist studies in Germany. So I automatically came into studying Islam and political science on the other hand. And this combination, I think, was very beneficial to my education because I, on the one hand, studied philological, historical subject, and on the other hand, social science subject. Two different perspectives in terms of scholarly work. And therefore, I'm also always interested in social theory on the one side, and then historical studies on the other side. Always when I get tired about theory, I have to move to empirical and historical work. And then probably I think, now a bit more theory again. I go back. So I'm shifting between these two worlds. And shifting between these two worlds also ended my romantic Orientalism and opened up to a different perspective on my study of the Middle East and of Islam. And we can go on to the next slide. I want to explain you how. In the 1990s, 95 and 96, I lived in Damascus. And I got a scholarship of the German Academic Exchange Service to study Fusha, high classical Arabic. Yes, I had a teacher, and I previously studied in Egypt. And when I was talking, my Syrian teacher, he always was looking at me and said, Dietrich, please, Lugha Arabiya al-Fusha bi-diqqatin. So precisely speak Fusha and not this Egyptian dialect. So he was very concerned, and he was a very good teacher, and we did the Fusha, and I lived for more than a year in Damascus. And the other thing on the left-hand side, what I had the chance is, during my studies, I did not read so many German novels. Not Karl May, now a bit more the elevated kind of literature. And the Goethe Institute in Damascus had a very good library. And in the evenings, I read German literature. And one book I read was Alfred Döblin's Berlin Alexanderplatz, as the subtitle, The Story of Franz Bieberkopf, which plays before the First World War in Berlin, and a very famous novel in Germany. And I read the novel, and in my daily life, I was in downtown Damascus. And the interesting thing was, I started to view my environment in which I was living as the stage of the novel I read. And I began to draw parallels. And certainly was Damascus of the 90s, not Berlin of the 1910s. But you nevertheless could draw some parallels. And the interesting thing was, I could spot a kind of Franz Bieberkopf in an Arabic version. And the people who, this is the Matter square in Damascus, and there you could see a lot of people who minded me to the social milieu in Alexanderplatz novel was presented. That is to say, what you could see here were some social phenomena where you could draw parallels. And these phenomena were rampant unemployment, social uprooting, people looking for day labor, petty crime, and even prostitution, all around this place. So what I started was a diachronic kind of making comparison. And this is what always has occupied me in terms of, we talk so much about differences, but I increasingly became interested in similarities and asking, are we? Yes, we are different, but we are not overly different. There are also parallels. And this search, I think, comes to the heart of what I present you now. Now, first a bit theory. We move on to, and I promise you not to go too deep into it, because then I might over you with my social theory things. My first approach is when you talk about modern times, you have to a certain extent to define what is modern. And there I stick pretty much to old school, that is a social differentiation school, but in the specific version of Niklas Luhmann, a German sociologist, who always said that modernity is not national. It is in principle global. It's kind of world society, and he defines it about the dominance of functional differentiation, that we understand society subdivided in politics, economics, religion, arts, sciences, and so on. And I adopt that as my theoretical language about modernity. However, modernity does not appear as a global project, embracing humanity as such, but it's very, very different projects. And there the sociologist Eisenstadt coined the term of multiple modernities.
He's the first one to coin the term?
He actually, in 2000, I think he's the first one who explicitly coined the term, but then it spread totally. And Eisenstadt's point was, which is very important, that he said, no, it's wrong to consider modernity in a mere secularist perspective. Religion, religious traditions, imperial traditions may play a role or may not play a role, but it depends on the historically concrete project of modernity. And this is basically what we just discussed before I started. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a project of modernity with religious traditions. Ataturk, or you could say Hasan al-Banna, is such a project, different from the Iranian one. But Ataturk is also one with a strict secularism. So it's not modernity as such, which is non-religious or religious. It depends on the social actors, the way they understand to be authentically modern. So concrete forms of modern social organization are therefore all general. They have a general conception, and they are historical particular due to contexts. And when we look at that, we have to, I like to do that eclectic. We have to apply different theories. When we talk about the macro, when we talk about global modernity, we have a macro sociological approach. When we talk about institutional forms, like, for example, the idea of Islamic governance by Hasan al-Banna, we talk about meso level of institutions, but we also can talk about the individual micro level, and we have to address these questions differently. And we cannot say from the macro perspective that the micro is wrong or the other way. That's too easy. And as that, religion may or may not play a role in these constructions of historical processes of modernity. And we see here with the two representatives of my talk today that you can be utterly different in the way you construct that. Let's go to social order and subjectivity. The first was my general theoretical approach, and this here is a bit more the conceptual thing. And I bother you again here with two German sociologists. The one is Peter Wagner, who has been teaching at the European University in Florence, and the other one is Andreas Reckwitz, with whom I studied together in Hamburg, and he is now a professor of cultural sociology in Berlin. And they were looking, or they differentiated in the modern development of Europe, three different kind of successive forms of modernity. Starting in the 19th century, what Wagner called a restricted liberal modernity, in which the classical bourgeois was the ideal type of the individual. And in this kind of modernity, in terms of literature, interesting would be to read Oliver Twist about Great Britain in the 19th century, and actually the mass of the people were downtrodden. There was only a very thin layer of liberals, and to be liberal was for them and not for the population. So that was what Wagner considered as this very restricted idea of liberal modernity, and the modern bourgeois was also a species which was not the majority of the population. Then, with the turn to the 20th century, he speaks about the collective nature of organized modernity. Here the national state comes in and mass society. And the population was taken in, but not with individual rights, but as a collective, in contradistinction to this restricted liberal modernity. So we have the first mass organizations, and the individual was considered to be a sort of peer group individual, an average type. We are all the same within the collective. And the first step they both work on is a kind of post-Second World War pluralist concept of extended liberal modernity, and this idea that individuals have their own plans and they are creative and entrepreneurial. It's very much, I think, linked to the rhetoric of the European Union when you look at it, where the origin comes from. And it is not that these steps are necessary consecutive steps, but they are clashing with each other. And I think that we are still in a period of time in the world where we have clearly struggled between organized modernity and pluralistic concepts of modernity with open end. But I apply these concepts in order to understand better what Ataturk and Hasan al-Banna tried to do. And as it is not very surprising, the major, the most important concept is this of organized modernity, and the average type of, in Ataturk's version, who is the modern Turk, and in Hasan al-Banna, who is a good modern Muslim. So they had also the idea how the individual should be shaped in this social order. So we can go on. With the next slide. Organized modernity had many phases and in very different political directions. It's again a German background. Yeah, you can see well on the right hand side a German Italian, because you have Mussolini and Hitler. On the left side, this is the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, what it means to be a socialist. I have chosen those because they are extremes as well, but they have nevertheless one common idea. The one is explaining how you are as a real socialist, and the other ones, they were convinced to know how the Italian and the German fascist nationalist should be. They had an idea about how to be as a modern German or Italian, and on the left side also as a modern German, but as a socialist worker. And it was the collective which was important. The individual was reflecting the nature of the collective. It was not that the individuals built the collective, it was the other way around. Decisive was the idea of the collective, the nation, or here, in the left side, it was not so much the nation, but the collective of the workers and the communist organization. But collectivity and organization was the major thing. Next step, two very different forms I would put here. On the left-hand side, this is American Fordism. It's called Fordism because of the first assembly lines of Ford. But it's the idea of a liberal society, nevertheless top-down organized, streamlined, and therefore this kind of analogy to the factory. And the right side, I would say then, is Hasan al-Banna direction. The collective organized as a religious collective, but also as a collective in which the individual is most importantly a part of the collective and resemble each other. So here we have four extremely different kinds, but what I wanted to show is there is great difference, but there are similarities in the way to conceptualize the collective, the order, and the organization. Okay, let's go on. Here we have, and now here my topic is the subject of the salaried masses. So this mass society comes in, but it has to be somehow educated into a modern, on the right side, Muslim, on the left side, a modern Turk. And Ataturk also himself called himself Baş Öğretmen, the leading teacher. And I took this caricature, and you all know Ataturk traveled the country and introduced the new alphabet. And he presented himself as the teacher of the nation, as the Baş Öğretmen. So he had a concept, an avant-gardist concept about how the Turk should be, even what language the Turk should speak, what kind of historical conception should be in mind. And he had an idea of what is the modern Turkish subject. On the right side, you have Mudakarat, Adawa, Adaiya, the autobiography of Hasan al-Banna, which partly is autobiographical, but partly probably also fictional, but it's his conceptualization of what a modern Muslim should be. And so here again, the individual, the two men constructed were different. But the idea that there is a kind of teacher who is avant-garde and who is able to tell the right ethical, normative, and political behavior is existent. Let's move on, and I think now we come to Hasan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood. Hasan al-Banna came from the province. He was not born in Cairo. He grew up in the provincial area of the Delta, and he got a traditional Islamic education, but he had a father who was very much also interested in literature and everything. So he's describing in the autobiography that they had a library at home, and that he and his brother were introduced in reading not only classical Islamic stuff, but also broad reading and also literature. And he indicated that his father was particularly interested in crime stories. So probably he would also have read Karl May, as I did when he was young. But as I indicated before, Hasan al-Banna was not alone satisfied with his, he memorized the Quran when he was, I think, 7 or so. But he wanted to go also to the modern school, the Egyptian new established modern schools of Egypt, to learn something about sciences and so on. And he started then in the teachers' seminar in Damanhur, where he got first education for primary school teacher. And he moved from Damanhur to the new open, new so-called modern college of the Dar al-Ulum in Cairo. And now this is important, the step from the Egyptian province to the capital, because this was a step into observing social deprivation, mass society in Cairo, and colonial domination altogether. That in the province you did not experience that in the same form, but in Cairo he was living in a new environment, in a new context, and he thought this context does not apply to my normative attitude to the world. here something you have to be active, you have to do, and one has also to not entirely militarily understand when Hasan al-Banna used very often the term of jihad. Jihad in this sense is also social activism, to engage in social movement activities. And together with this experience, he was very close to the reformist circles around Rashid Ridda, the previous student of Muhammad Abduh, Syrian background, coming to Cairo, and the editor of Al-Manar, the reformist journal. And Hasan al-Banna even tried, after the death of Ridda, to continue the journal. So what comes together is the provincial background, the move into the capital, which was dominated by colonial politics, where he saw social deprivation and what he thought a deviation from the straight path of the Muslim. And then he got his first postman in Ismailia, at the Suez Canal, as a teacher, and there he started the Muslim Brotherhood as his form of social actorhood, which was at the first inner mission, in a sense, to teach Muslims how to be a good Muslim. Not to convert other people, but to convert inside, that what he saw in Cairo, this is not the way of life. Good, and I underline, a good modern Muslim should live. Because he was also impregnated by the modernist ideas of Cairo. So this is the background, and then the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood went very accelerated from first a missionary kind of religious movement to a socio-political movement and to a mass movement, in which the mass movement adopted many forms, kind of body politics in uniforms, ceremonies, Boy Scout groups, paramilitary groups, local branches, provincial branches, students' organization, and so on. So a sisters' organization, but there were always a bit tensions between the brothers and the sisters, as you might know. And so all what we imagine with a modern kind of mass organization, he built up and made the Muslim Brotherhood to the strongest organization, not only in Egypt, but in the Middle East, and to a blueprint almost for many Muslim communities in the world. And that happened within 10 to 20 years. This was, on the one hand, his achievement, but on the other hand, also the time. I think you are not as an individual as strong as to make something such a success. You need also the particular right time to go that way. Let's go to Mustafa Kemal. This is the way the elder statesman, which at least before the AKP was governing the country, but the AKP, in my opinion, also has not just dropped the heritage of Ataturk. And on the right side, you see the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, the Republican People Party, which is also a mass organization, which also applied these organizational features. And you see the arrows, which are the political pillars of Ataturk and his reforms, which is republicanism, statism, nationalism, and so on. So you have again a leader, a mass organization in a party form, but certainly not starting out as a religious movement, but from the beginning starting out as a nationalist political movement. Now, where did Mustafa Kemal Ataturk come from? Not from the center of the Ottoman Empire, but from Saloniki, what today Greece. And so he came from Europe, and he went through the officer colleges in Istanbul, was educated, and became a young member of the Committee of Unit and Progress, you know, the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Dalal Pasha, and was from the beginning in the nationalist movement with the Ottoman military educational background. He was engaged in the Revolution 98 against Abdul Hamid, and later became an officer in the Ottoman army. Very important for his career, I think, is his charisma, what he could get as a military officer in the only great success of the Ottoman Russian forces in the First World War, and that was Gallipoli. In the defense of the Dardanelles and the Straits against the Allied troops, something which when I lived in Turkey, I was really surprised. There's a commemoration every year, and there Turkish families and families, particularly from New Zealand and Australia, meet because the colonial army was sent in front, and most of the dead British soldiers were actually from Australia and from New Zealand, and not from Great Britain proper. And they still commemorate this battle because it had so high numbers of victims, and it's a joint Turkish and I think there were no Indian troops involved, because part of the colonial troops were also Indian soldiers at the British time. So here he got his first military charisma, and then in the defense against the Greek occupation troops in the War of Independence in Anatolia, he got a second charisma. And what is very interesting, Sharif Mardin, the great historian and sociologist from Turkey, he went through the archives and he found also many sources that ordinary people almost equated Ataturk in this military strife with the prophet. And Ataturk and the troops even used green flags. And Ataturk did not say, I have nothing to do with the prophet. He took this charisma with him. He later, then he established the republic. He subverted that. But in the military struggle, he fairly accepted that people rallied behind him, some of them as complete secularists, other ones as believers. And he also had much support by the Sufi organizations, the Tariqat, in the country, and he used that to rally and in the end to victorious fight against the Greek occupation troops. So this the background of the man, how he climbed up from an ordinary military officer to the father of the state. And now you should see he could use Islamic traditions in his military strife. But in establishing a government against the Ottoman government, he had to get rid of Islam, because the Ottoman dynasty, had two sources of legitimacy. The one was the dynasty, the family thing, monarchy, and the other one was Islam. So this new Republican elite, in order to establish themselves as the ruler of the country, they could not use Islam in this sense. They had, and there Ataturk was using his knowledge. He also had many negotiations with the European powers, his knowledge of Europe. And if you visit once the Anıt Kabir, the mausoleum of Ataturk, you will see that there are exposed writings of French positivists. That's to say, Comte and the early sociological school and up to Durkheim, which, if people ask me if there's one nation-building process in which you can trace the translation of academic work into policy work, then it's in Turkey. And it's mostly due to Ziya Gökalp, whom Ataturk said the intellectual father of the nation. And Zia Gökalp was fascinated by French sociology, and in particular by Emile Durkheim, translated that into Turkish. He did not study there. Some Egyptian guys did at Sorbonne. The background of Taha Hussein comes also from that. Abda al-Razik, who wrote this book on the Caliphate, he was in France, and his brother, who was for a couple of years the director of Al-Azhar, he also studied under Durkheim in France. But Zia Gökalp, he was only fascinated by the work. He was not in France, but he took it up and wrote about Turkish nationalism from this kind of sociological perspective. And you can see the traces in this iconoclastic reforms of Ataturk after 23, how he constructed the nation, being informed by this kind of academic theories. It's very rare, I think, that academics make the way in direct politics, but here you have some traces which I found as a sociologist also very interesting to discover. So,
can I just cut you? I would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Ataturk, was he a Turk originally by nation?
The question is, what is a Turk? That's very tricky. You could say Ataturk coming today. You could even say, and this is off record. He was a Northern Macedonian, but he actually spoke Turkish. But you know, also after the people exchange, we had in Greece, was it Prime Minister or President? Prime Minister Karamanlis. But Karaman is the Black Sea, and the Karamanlis were those Greek-speaking Turks, or how you want to call it, Christian Orthodox, who have been moved from the Black Sea coast to the Peloponnese.
So assuming at that time Constantinople was a mixture of all the nations comes in, and
Anatolia was a mosaic, and it also there were many Tartar Turks moving from Russia.
Yes.
You might know that right after the fall of the Soviet Union, Süleyman Demirel called in a Turkish meeting in Istanbul, but he had to discover when he spoke Anatolian Turkish, people from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan not necessarily understood him. So the connotation of the Turk is a broad one. And certainly, if you ask me, he was an Ottoman.
He was Ottoman, yeah.
And the Ottomans, there's a very good book of American colleague, historian Proviance, who was writing that the history that the Ottoman Empire just disappeared is wrong. There were many with an Arab background who felt to be Ottoman and were desperate after the First World War because what they related as identity to disappeared, but they had still the identity of being Ottoman.
Is it at that time the Ottoman Empire already finished, or Sultan Abdulhamid is still there?
No, Sultan Abdulhamid was not anymore there in the First World War. This was Sultan Reshad, but he was powerless, basically, and
A puppet.
yeah, a puppet. And this made Ataturk strong because he said, look at this government in Istanbul. They sacrificed the nation. We will defend the nation, but we don't do it anymore on the platform of Islam, but on Turkish nationalism.
So
Turkism.
He was riding on the collapse and the weakness of the Ottoman Empire, and so at that time people were looking for a stronger leader to lead them. Was it?
It was a military strife, and you should see that the Ottoman Empire was in a military struggle, not only beginning with the First World War, but with the Balkan Wars since, you could say, 1911. So they went through almost 10 years of war. Then the defense against the Greek, and the Republican forces, partly the forces fighting with Ataturk, wanted to re-establish the Sultanate. But in the post-war struggle, the Republican, he was a shrewd politician. He marginalized this part who wanted to re-establish.
Was this an intended
Yes.
politically?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He and Inoni, in my opinion, clearly knew what he wanted.
Not something that he found along the way. No?
Yeah, you always also found something along there. Look, he was sent to Samsun by the Ottoman government as a delegate. And that opened him a window of opportunity to rally Anatolia behind him in distinction to Istanbul. So when you ask me, he had the idea of a republican nation before, but the opportunity to establish it, he actually even needed that the Greek troops attacked Anatolia, I think.
So it was an intention.
There was an intention, but there were windows of opportunity. And I'm absolutely convinced without Ataturk and Inani, Turkey would today not exist. Because the war allies, they just wanted to distribute between France, England, Italy, Greek, and nothing would have been remained.
Because the intent is to split everything.
There was the Ottoman Empire for them was over. And Ataturk clearly also in Lausanne, or it was more Ismet Inani, they argued on the platform not to re-establish the Ottoman Empire, but taking Wilson's idea of the self-determination of a people. And he said, the people are the Muslims of Anatolia. These are the people. And there's an interesting quote by the General Chief of Staff of the British Army. He said to this quote of Inani, Muslim people of Anatolia, he said, yes, this is a people. They have the right to establish a nation. So you know, we have this kind of complex struggle.
Anatolia is on the south.
Anatolia is the most western part of Asia, which is sort of, you cannot really call it a peninsula, but you have the Black Sea, Mediterranean. It's this part what is Turkey proper today. The Turks always also wanted northern Iraq, parts of it, also because they are Turkmen people, but Turkmens are also different kind of Turkish people. But they ended up, because the colonial interests of Britain and France were too important, so they ended up with Anatolia proper. And then there was this first crazy population exchange in Greece, Russia, and Armenia, and people were just distributed around. But the idea was to have, and that's the irony of history, I would say. What made Turkey possible was venturing into the idea of giving the Muslim people of Anatolia self-determination in establishing the most laicist state of the region. Then later. So, but final point, intention, but many windows of opportunities and historical accidental things that happen, making it possible.
Right man, right place, right time.
Yeah. Also, I mean, he has established, you can see the military tactician behind it, the way he worked. I think you needed this kind of experience also to come along with that.
Maybe the military platform set
but
gives him vision.
Look, he played with all these actors. He talked completely different over the representatives of Great Britain, of France, of Russia. He severed all his ties to the Germans because that was necessary at that point. But to his hinterland, he still accepted to be considered as a Muslim leader. So
the irony is that, like, we all Malaysian when we go to Turkey, because we were told that Ataturk is, not so much of good things,
It's
But
okay.
for the people of Turkey, Ataturk is a hero of Turkey. The nation, yeah.
To be honest,
Yeah.
when I'm observing the political strategies and moves of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, then I always have the feeling he closely has read the biography of Ataturk. He resembles, and has probably had the most impact since Ataturk on the country, but he resembles in his moves also after the coup. Ataturk had so-called Izmir coup against him, and when you look at that, I think it was in 1927, alleged assassination attempt. And the steps he took to eliminate his political opposition and so very much reminded me, and it never was clear, was there an attempt or not? And when I ask my Turkish friends, they get into quarrels about it, because they say either the government knew, but they used this as an opportunity, and the other said, never ever, it was at edge. The only thing, when you ask me, as somebody who has been working a lot with Turkish history, this was an amateurish coup in comparison to what happened before in Turkey. That, at least, I would say. Who conducted it? Don't ask me. If my Turkish friends do not know it, why should I know it? But the political culture established by Ataturk is still visible. And I would say it's still impregnated by this culture. And when you ask me, yes, Ataturk salvaged that there is something remaining from the Ottoman time. That you can do neo-Ottoman politics today is the heritage of a staunch anti-Ottoman politician like Ataturk.
Was he one of
Probably
the
we continue the discussion.
Yes.
We finish the presentation.
Yeah, because we have some slides left
Yeah.
to continue.
Yeah. Okay. Next slide. Yeah.
And I already was in it. We have to see the contexts. And when you look the context of Hasan al-Banna, on the left-hand side you have Zaghloul, where he went with the Wafd, the delegation, to the negotiations after the First World War. And he claimed independence for Egypt. And they were just more or less thrown out. No, they were not accepted. This was the liberal Egyptian elite. And Saad Zaghloul was also a student of Muhammad Abduh. He was a representative of the Islamist modernists of Egypt. But this, and think about my successive modernities, these Egyptian bourgeois liberal kind of elite completely failed politically. They could not achieve Egypt's independence. On the contrary, what happened was the revolution in 19, and the incarceration of Saad Zaghloul, and then he died. And in that time, the young Hasan al-Banna became politicized. And he could see this kind of Europeanized liberals, they did not make it. They could not, against France and Britain, push independence for Egypt. We need an authentic Islamic Egyptian movement to achieve that. So, as we already discussed much about Turkey, this is a completely different setting. And this elite also worked together certainly with the, in terms of ethnicity, Albanian kind of monarchy of Egypt. So you could see that the Egyptian mass movement easily, if not almost necessarily, could combine Islam and Egyptian nationhood. And the elite basically in the 19th century failed. And that made certainly the Muslim Brotherhood a very strong alternative to classical nationalist politics in Egypt. I already went into it. To this elite, also religious elites like the Rasid brothers belonged, The Azhar was in critique at that time, and Taha Hussein, the blind, then Minister of Culture and Education. So all these Egyptian liberals, they could not deliver. The other irony of history was the military delivered later with the young officers, but they only could with the support of the Muslim Brotherhood. But 2 years later, they were the most brutal suppressors of the Muslim Brotherhood, much more brutal than the liberals. So Nasser then shifted, and I showed, you should try to Google, when there are these YouTube videos of Nasser. And I showed my students, because my students, this generation, they do not know so much about history. And also, you know that in Europe always the big question application is always predicated on the hijab. Although one could say, why is that so important? But it is. Now, for my students, a Muslimah necessarily has a hijab. I showed them the video from the 1950s. You also can look at videos from the independence of Malaysia, and you will see a lot of American-style hair of women without a hijab. But the interesting thing is with Nasser, he talks, but then to an entirely male group in Cairo, about a meeting he had with Hodaybi, the new, after the assassination of Hasan al-Banna, the new leader, Murshid of the Brotherhood. And he ridicules him. And he says, look, this guy said to me, you have to impose that Egyptian women wear the hijab. I said to him, is your daughter not studying medicine in Cairo? And he said, yes, she's at the university. So I asked him, is she wearing the hijab at the university? You know, Rais, no, she is not, but... And then he says to the crowd, he asks me that I impose on millions of Egyptian women to wear the hijab, as he cannot impose it to his daughter. So that was the rhetoric against the Brotherhood. And my students were stunned by that this is the leader of Egypt. Abdel Fattah Sisi would not say something like that today. So that I think it's important to see historically how the Nasserists basically used the Brotherhood in coming to power and joined their ranks, and later, and I think a certain parallel we could see with this so-called Arab Spring, where it was also okay for the military to have the Brotherhood in order to get the liberals more out. Let the Brotherhood do, and they obstructed the rule of the Brotherhood completely with raising petrol prices, and there are a lot of trickery from the military, and then disposing them again. And it's almost 52 to 54 again. We start in a new way, and the Brotherhood is persecuted, and a military officer is Rais. So the political history of Egypt is completely different than Turkey, and it has to do with the historical context of becoming an independent national state, and who were the forces competing against each other. The last, that's one of my favorite. If the last slide, or not, here, at first, we discussed that already. Here is Ataturk and Ismet Inönü in Lausanne, 1923, the two chief negotiators making the independence possible. On the right-hand side, you have the First World War on the Gallipoli, and the picture left on top shows, it's a bit too small. It shows Ataturk together with Liman von Sanders. Liman von Sanders was a Prussian officer he was the lead officer, and Ataturk was his assistant in Gallipoli. And they both have on their uniforms the Prussian-German Iron Cross, the medal. So you could see how close actually Prussian, Turkish, or Ottoman military cooperation was at that point in the First World War. The next picture. And that brings me back to your question about Ataturk. You have on the left-hand side on top the military officer, and yeah, you can see the Iron Cross, the Prussian one, on his stomach. On the right side on top, you have the impression of a very strong, legal, formal bureaucrat.
You look like a lawyer.
Yeah, like a lawyer. On the left side down there, you have the elder statesman and the military in the background. And I use the picture as a single picture on the right-hand side down there to ask my students who rather would say this is Ernest Hemingway, but it is Ataturk, because he also represented the intellectual, the bohemian almost, with the cigarette and so on. Why do I show this? Because Anatolia was a mosaic. And the nationalist movement was made up of representatives of these people, all nurtured by the state. Not entrepreneurs, not Sufis, not ulama, military officers, state bureaucrats, intellectuals and teachers, and the political elite. And it's fascinating when you see all these pictures and postcards which exist from Ataturk. Every social group has its own Ataturk. And that's, from a sociological perspective, Ataturk is the crystallization rallying around this new nation and having a resemblance to different social groups. And this, I would say, marks the utter success. I do not understand if people tell me that Ataturk failed or the Turkish nation building process failed. Turkey is a very nationalist country making a nation out of scratch, basically, as a modern nation. The Ottoman Empire was an empire, and it was something different. But the Turkish nation and the strength of nationalist sentiments in Turkey from the left to the right can only be explained in this policy of Ataturk and his way to integrate this nation in a project. And therefore, probably also this puzzling thing, on the one hand, you say, Ataturk, this was actually also Hasan al-Banna was writing about Ataturk, that he was a great leader, but he forgot why he could become a great leader. That was because of God's bless for him, and that he rejected. Because the Egyptian prime minister took Ataturk as a kind of symbolic figure of successful independence struggle, and then Hasan al-Banna said, well, but what you forget, he was praying in the desert for being a military successful leader, and God gave him the strength, and then he pushed God away. That was Banna's argument, and that was his fault. And you will see that similarly here, closer to the region, the Khilafat movement in India also at first thought, oh, Ataturk, he's the real one. But then said also, okay, betrayal in religious terms. But out of the nation building process in Turkey, he knew, I think he was an agnostic, if not even an atheist. Ataturk and Inani also. But it would be completely wrong to consider that the whole Turkish Republic was non-religious. Becoming a Turkish citizen, you best have to be a Sunni Muslim. already under Ataturk. Otherwise, there was no entrance ticket. And we know that because the archives are open today, and they haven't been 20, 30 years ago. So we know that from historical research, that there were always two nationalist forces struggling in Turkey, the secularist one and the Sunni nationalist one. And the Sunni is important because not the Kızılbaş, the Alawi part, which makes probably 20% of the Turkish people are Alawites, Alevi, and not Sunni Muslims. But these two, a religious nationalist, and today the religious nationalists control politics, and previously the secular nationalists control politics. But the parallels are also, they remain Turkish nationalists, and it's not so that Erdogan does everything different from previous, like Ecevit, or the only female one, Tansu Çiller, which, however, my Turkish friends always say she was the worst. Çiller in terms of corruption and things. And I agree that with Margaret Thatcher and with Tansu Çiller, we have learned that the gender question is not decisive whether politics is good or bad. It depends on the politician. Okay, last but not least, these are the flags of
OIC.
Yeah, of the OIC. And I just put this picture as a conclusion. Now, if you think about what these flags represent in terms of political systems, you find liberal democracies, electoral democracies, military rule, dictatorships. You find everything. And somehow, some of them connected to Islam and some don't. So there are actually, then you could say, you could support Halak's position to say it makes no sense to speak about the Islamic State because you have to separate that. The state is the state and it's a modern invention. And if you want to put it into Islamic classics, at least, you get a problem. But on the other hand, there are certainly a number of states with very different religious political connotations. While the Islamic Republic argues we are the real Islamic State and even defines the political elite through religious kind of argumentation. In Saudi Arabia, you have an entirely secular family in the sense, a monarchy with thousands of members, but deriving legitimacy as protectors of the holy places and their form of collaboration with the ulama. And then you go to Morocco or to Jordan, and you have the legitimacy of the monarchs in tracing themselves back in the genealogy to the Prophet. And you had Hasan Turabi in Sudan supporting a military regime from an Islamic perspective. So it is empirically not so that you cannot have Islamic politics. And I think your previous Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, also said that the actually real Islamic State is Malaysia. So for me as an observer, I'm always puzzled and think, okay, luckily I do not have to make the choice what is right and what is wrong. I'm just observing. But I hope you got my major point in positioning similarities and differences of these two outer poles of Muslim politics in order to say that is probably the range. And there are arguments for it and against it, but in the end, it's the people who define what is the right thing to do, and probably not only the leaders. But thank you for spending this morning with me and listening to some of my ideas to these two political figures of the Muslim parts of the world. Thank you.
Dankeschön, thank you very much
Bitte schön, gerne geschehen.
for the wonderful presentation. Okay, now we open the floor to more discussion. I believe our audience has a lot of questions pertaining to the contemporary models of the Muslim states and also contemporary states in Turkey and Egypt. Okay.
I would like to refer to your last slide. No?
Yeah.
You can see it's the same colors. The colors are all the same, more or less.
Well, what do you mean?
Colors,
The green and all.
and then,
Albania is red and black.
but basically during Ataturk's runnings in the revolution, there is a Nursi movement in between. By the Zaman said Nursi.
Yes, I know.
And then when Ataturk comes out through the declaration of Republic of Turkey, the Islamists within the Diyanet circles, is always there.
Yeah.
So the runnings up between the non-Islamic and Islamic entities is always there. You can remember Adnan Mandares and also all those policies until Turgut Özal and those things. So the rising of Islam is all the ways.
Also, Süleyman Demirel used in his, when he spoke to ordinary Turkish people, he also used Islamic language already. I mean, this was always there. And when you mentioned Said Nursi, he came back. I think he was in Russian military confinement after the war, and he came back to Ankara and actually met the Republicans, but very quickly discovered these are not the guys supporting my ideas. And then he withdrew more from the public, where he was more visible in Ottoman times than in Republican. Then he started to also write his Risale Nur and so on. So, but as I mentioned, I think Turgut Özal, much more than Menderes, had Islamic political agenda with him, because Menderes, I would judge more that he could see when Menderes was the first one where Turkey had, because of its NATO membership, to open the electoral kind of scene to become an electoral democracy. Inani was steering the country with a single party thing until the end of the Second World War. But with NATO membership and the opening up, multi-party system had to be established. And therewith also the Anatolian provinces came into politics, because before this was steered by Ankara and Istanbul. But people of the provinces, when, I visited several times in the beginning of the 2000s. I lived in Turkey, but visited often Turkey, but also visited Iran. Turkey always was for me the much more religious country when you travel through than Iran. You will not find any public bus in Turkey with not a kind of religious sticker on it or any. And the Naqshbandiya was very strong also in the parties. Süleyman Demirel was close to the nation. So also under Kemalism, Islam was not disappearing. It was suppressed by a political elite. But permanently, and Erbakan, Refah, and his movement. So this was before the AKP existed. Definitely.
I just sort of want to see your mind the similarities and parallel between al-Banna and Kamal. My concern is yourself as an observer. The influence al-Banna and perhaps there are some differences, meaning Kamal did raise and elevate at the level of leading a nation.
Yeah,
Hasan al-Banna, I think, didn't get to that.
yeah,
Okay. But then the influence is significant. Both, I mean, for us, Ikhwan Muslimin methodology of reform, organized modernity, and perhaps looking at Turkey now with Erdogan going to be influencing the world with their position. To your mind, this notion of organized modernity for the Muslim, would Hasan al-Banna's methodology or conceptual, when he looks about how to reform and his good brand of people, his immediate followers came up with multiple ideas, and most of it trying to evolve back to Rashid Reza and all that was the more organized, the prophetic model, as compared to perhaps Kamal Ataturk without those kind of framework. Where do you think will be the significant influence for the more Muslim thinking? Because I think Hasan al-Banna's methodology, well accepted, is more through the educational, through the reform, not the political will of the government, the state for that matter. So, do you have some thoughts about how they must move forward?
I think that on Hasan al-Banna's political thinking and on his conception of Islamic government, it's absolutely decisive, the idea of what I would still call the classical Salafiyya of the 19th century. And that you also can see that Hasan al-Banna is writing about the Aqd al-Ijtimai, the social contract. Now, yesterday's discussion, Europeans would say that social contract is European idea, isn't it? French Revolution. I would claim one can see around in different cultures in the world ideas of social contract. Decisive for Hasan al-Banna's, and as an observer, I cannot say, you could say this is a strategy, or you could say he still believed. But he's arguing that the social contract was what already Abu Bakr fought as a Salafi, as a direct follower of the Prophet. And therefore you have legitimacy for this institution. And what I think is very important is this, at his time, and this probably also was a reason why he went to the Dar al-Ulum and not to the Azhar. Azhar was under very strong critique in the classical alim of Egypt. I remember when I read Al-Ayyam, the autobiography of Taha Hussein. When he comes to Cairo and to the Azhar, he was disappointed. He was fascinated by Muhammad Abdus and his disciple, but the Azhar as such was considered. Rashid Rida wrote in al-Banna an encounter, it's called المحاورات بين المجتهد والمقلد, the negotiation or communication between the traditionalist and the reformer. A young reformer is speaking to the sheikh, and the sheikh said, "Oh, you should not read all this stuff. Just take it quietly, and God will arrange things." And the young reformer said, "No, we have to be active. It's not that way." So that is the milieu, the intellectual in which Hasan al-Banna has been raised. And there it was also important that you could go back behind the whole tafsir and fiqh tradition and say, no, our resource are the Salafis and the rightly guided community of Medina. And this is, I think, in the Brotherhood, the most important point. And he was also close to the Salafi bookshop in Cairo, and all these kind of circles around.
That seems to be the acceptance of our part of the world as well. That Ikhwan Muslimin's methodology is mostly related to the Salafiyah and the references, sources, what Quran and Sunnah, and because the legitimacy is there.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about whether it's a political will or whether it's the ability of educationists, which is even our current minister's issue, do we have political will or do we wait for education to help change society, organize our society?
But there, I think you have meanwhile, and very important was Qaradawi in that, a development there. The classical alim or ulama were working hard to come into the picture again and say, no, you cannot just say fiqh has, and indeed, I mean, this is enormous intellectual heritage of the Muslim people. Fiqh. And he said, you cannot just say this is irrelevant, because here you have over centuries the struggle with contemporary situations and classical scripture. And you cannot avoid that when you go back to the Salah. You also are confronted with that you have to set it into the context. So you can learn from fiqh, but what Muhammad Abdu always rejected, not taqleed, not just following it. And what very often is not seen with Muhammad Abdu, he meant that both. I mean, today many Salafis hate him. But he was not a Europeanizer in this sense, because he said taqleed is bad with respect to our own heritage, but it's also bad with respect to European institutions. We have to look, and Tantawi already did that 50 years before. We have to look what could be useful and what do we have to reject. We have no blind following, neither in our own tradition nor in the innovations we can see in Europe. And I think the second part of the meaning of taqleed in Abdul kind of intellectual cosmos is very often forgotten. And he's equated with a complete Europeanizer, which I think is wrong.
Why do you choose a comparison of similarity to be specific? Hasan al-Banna vis-a-vis Ataturk. Why not Jamal Abdul Nasir was vis-a-vis Hasan al-Banna? Because their context is a bit similar then. For me,
I choose, there are many variables why you choose something. The first idea I got as my PhD candidate, Ahmed came to me. He wrote about the period, Nasrian period of suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood based on autobiographies, archival material, where I can also tell you something interesting in archival comparisons. And he said to me, you should read that. And he came with the biography. He said, read this. I know you have been working a lot about Turkey. I'm amused in reading it. And that was when Hasan al-Banna went into Ataturk. And I thought, I was not aware that he actually wrote about Ataturk before. And I read that and I thought, that's interesting. Okay. And on the other hand, then I thought, yeah, but it's almost normal from the perspective that you could see this guy established an independent state against the great powers. So what could I probably learn from him? So it's not so, but that was one step. Then I was not interested in comparing, and equally, Nasser was never a secularist like Ataturk. Nasser also was speaking with two tongues. And that Ataturk did not. I mean, you probably know that he even went out in public with Raqqa and said, you know, the Ottomans, they did it behind walls, I do it in public. And he drank. he was an iconoclast. He wanted to destroy. Nasser never would have done something like that. But certainly, Nasser's wife did not have a headscarf, and he posted himself as secular, but he was a different type. But that was not interesting for me. I wanted to compare the most opposite ones and ask. And what I found in them was that they had similar ideas, that they belong to an avant-garde who is able to shape the nation, the ideal type of a good modern Egyptian Muslim, a secular Turk, and that with a mass movement. And I would also say that Hasan al-Banna, he never became the leader of a nation. But if you look, we discussed yesterday at politics from Sadat via Mubarak to Fattah al-Sisi, there's a lot of brotherhood in it. Even they all suppressed it.
To us as well. It comes to us as well. It's a global thing.
So you do not have to be the leader of the nation in having a strong political impact.
I was wondering whether you research a bit from these two personalities and its influence to the association. I mean, how much would, I mean, we know that Hasan Banna, but how much Turkish, Kamal Ataturk's influence on, say, Indonesia or Malaysia?
I think what is there are striking parallels to Indonesia, also in terms of language policies in the period of nation building, but now don't ask me. I'm not an expert whatever of Indonesian politics and Islam, but I think that the nationalist avant-garde in Indonesia also looked at Turkey and had. I more know about because I have written about Snukur Ronje and about the earlier independence movement in Indonesia. Here in Horizonte, you also have the idea to use academic insights in terms of colonial politics. Now, Horizonte was a very difficult character for all involved, whether here in this part of the world or in Europe. He was supporting the Dutch colonial enterprise, but very often at odds with The Hague. For example, the idea he got this scholarship to go to Mecca as Abdul Ghafoor, and we until today we have the question: did he really convert? Was he a Muslim, or was this just fake? That he nobody can. There are different opinions on it, but he was funded by the Dutch state because the Dutch politicians thought people from Indonesia come to Mecca, become radicalized, go back and go against the administration in Indonesia. And he was in the community of Achinese, and he came back and he said, this is all nonsense. And the Dutch government was not happy about that, to hear that he now comes and says, it's nonsense, they are not radicalized there. Problems are different while people are radicalized. But he had the idea, as far as I remember it now, we have to strengthen the aristocratic traditions of Indonesia against the imams and ulama. That will work. And then we just lift the Indonesian on Dutch civilizational standards, and things are perfect. Indonesia becomes a part of the Netherlands. As we all know, this did not work out that way. But he has done that with his study of fiqh, Islamic law, his actually first anthropological studies on the Achinese people, two volumes. So he was one of the first Orientalists who actually not only worked with texts, but really also in Aceh. And I think a fascinating part of historical encounter, and which also shows you how wrong social engineering ideas very often go. Because he, in the end, through the educational system and all of these things, in the end, he supported the independence movement and also the Islamic character, rather, as we like to say today, moderate Islamic character. But he contributed, in my opinion, to the very fact that also in Indonesia, Islam played a role in the nationalist movement against his will. And now, from a post-colonial perspective, people would say, yes, he was a racist, and it was okay. All people were racist in that time of history. And I know, to be honest, I know also many Arab racists. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, I will say that black people are often the term abd is still applicable, which comes from slavery. So I think sometimes the Europeans have done bad things, but it's not only them who have done bad things. But the interesting thing is I do not know whether you know this history that the Ottoman Sultan proclaimed a jihad in 1914. A jihad of, and now the interesting thing is, this is the only jihad together with Christian major forces, namely with Austria and with Germany, Russian Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Austria and Germany in a jihad against Britain and France in the First World War. And the idea was to rally worldwide Muslims against the Axis. But even more interesting is that the initial idea comes from Berlin, from Istanbul. And Horgranje thought this was a ridiculous idea. And he said only the German Orientalists, his colleagues, could have imposed this idea on German politics. And he was outraged, and he was writing to the German Orientalists, you discredit completely our civilizational mission in Indonesia. The Indonesians are almost prepared to go our way. And now you come with this crazy jihad, you come with atavistic kind of ideas, and you mess up the world. And when you read that, then you get the feeling, okay, he believed in this. In retrospect, the civilizing mission, many use that as a means of exploitation, certainly. But one should also not underestimate that some people, we talk about the late 19th century and early 20th century, they had that mindset. So it's a fact. So the only thing I know about Indonesia is through Horgranje. So that is biased, certainly. But I think one can. It would be interesting to really make a good comparative study of Turkey and Indonesia and the way into political independence. I think that would be very interesting.
What the condition of the masses for the both of Mustafa Kamal and also Hasan al-Banna, that was able for him to execute his project or his vision, the condition of the masses.
The message they had?
The masses.
I think there we have to differentiate. There in the Ataturk thing, the military officer comes in. I mean, Hasan al-Banna had to convince the people no means of physical force. Ataturk, not as a major resource, used them, but he used them when he needed them. That Hasan al-Banna never could do. Hasan al-Banna had, I think, the advantage that he incarnated almost this Effendiya, this new coming national middle class of Egypt, in whose life Islam played a role. and where Islam, and that was not in Turkey. In Egypt, Islam became the major, in my opinion, in my reading, the major source of establishing an authentic alternative to the colonial position of politics. And there Hasan al-Banna, and that also shows the movement, he first not came with politics. He first came with the authority of somebody who could interpret the Islamic traditions in the way people understood it in coffee shops. And he actually learned from the Christian missionaries what they have done and failed, because the Christians never understood that a Muslim would not just convert to Swedish Protestantism. But Hasan al-Banna saw that you have to address the ordinary people in ordinary ways. And there probably, I would say, he at that point had not the political project. But he saw that the masses were following him. And then he increasingly became also a politically thinking man more. So that is a completely different approach. Ataturk salvaged the nation in a military struggle. He had a military charisma, and throughout his rule, he ruled with the military charisma. And then, as a sociologist, Max Weber said, at one point, charisma has to be traditionalized. It has to be institutionalized, because it's knitted to the person. But when the person is dead, you cannot continue if you do not have an institution. And that Ataturk already built up the People's Party, where Inoni was the head, and Inoni used the single party regime. I mean, Inoni with the party infiltrated the whole country. And what they have done, the Kemalists, you could not be the leading school teacher in Mardin, in coming from Mardin. You have to be sent from Ankara. The governors were not from the region. They were all loyal Ataturkists and party members. So the party infiltrated the whole country. And the party substituted Ataturk's military charismatic position of the salvage of the nation. And then the interesting thing is, now all of a sudden, Inoni lost this instrument in the 1950s, 60s because of the multi-party system. And what happened? In 1960, Alparslan Türkeş came with the army and said, we are saving secularism and Ataturk's heritage. The military is the institution. So the military took over from Ataturk, the People's Party, and then the military. And in 2010, it was Recep Tayyip Erdogan taking over from the military. And we have again a party now representing the nation. So I think Egypt, in Egypt we have no change since Nasser, when you ask me, in political structure. The military is controlling politics and economy. I mean, all major industries are in the hand of the military. It's not so visible at first, but everybody knows in Egypt, and therefore it's not just to have this officer in charge as a president. The Brotherhood was certainly a threat, probably more economic threat than a political, to the Egyptian, much entrenched Egyptian system.
Even to America, they're seen as an economic force.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been living in the 80s in Egypt, and I will remember when I was once, and I was at that time not yet an academic, and I was in Gardaga, which is now a huge tourist spot, and at that time there were some shacks you could spend your night. There was nothing, and an Egyptian military officer invited me, a young German student kind of type, for having barbecue, and was telling me his worldview. And this was in 1980. And he said, Camp David was the only right thing to do. This is draining our resources. The clash with Israel, it's killing us. For what sake? And they got the Sinai back. So, and if you look at politics in Egypt, I still think that this worldview and rationale is dominant. It's incompatible with the Brotherhood's vision, but from the Egyptian military and business class perspective, I think it's still what we can observe. And so we talk about completely different structures in which the one could climb up to be the hero of the nation, and the other one has been assassinated, but have had nevertheless on Egyptian society a major impact.
Beyond.
And beyond. No, I mean when you think the Brotherhood all over the world, it was kind of blueprint of organizing.
Because you talk about organized. And Imam al-Banna has that clear notion of organizing and the phases we go through and the things we have to do.
The other thing is interesting how the Brotherhood then related to different political elites. And we had a study where we compared Islamic welfare organizations in Egypt with Jordan. Now, in Egypt, when we used the term Islamic, they said, no, we are not Islamic. They clearly were Islamic, but you could not say that in Egypt. It was dangerous to use that the term. Yeah. In Jordan, they said, yes, we are Islamic. What else should we be? and we also went to the charity branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. But as the Muslim Brotherhood had at that point no issue with the dynasty and the king, this was no problem. They had no political stakes against the ruling elite, which in Jordan is the Hashemite dynasty and the leading Bedouin sheikhs, which are also controlling the secret service and the military. And in Egypt, we have a completely different setting. So, and there, I think you can see there you have structures in which only particular types of people can raise.
Can relate.
Yeah, but you also need these people to have an impact. It's not the one or the other. It's somehow a combination.
Prof, one question from me. I read that Kamal Ataturk was, I don't know, before he joined the military or after or during he was in military, he was a teacher, which means that he would go to the mosque, from mosque to mosque to teach people on Islamic thing. Am I correct?
On Islam, when should that have been? Under Ottoman rule still, or?
During his young life.
I never read about that, and I read many biographies of Ataturk, that he had the teacher attitude. There's no question.
But does he go from
But-
to
but-
teach people about
About Islam and proper that I have never read. He was teaching with relationship to Islam that this should be a private matter. That he has done. That in together also with his language teachings and things, and then you have also this the establishment. But there he was already president of the two institutions, the Tarikh Kurumu, the historical institution of the Turk, where historical evidence was provided that the original Turks come from Central Asia and all this kind of stuff. And the so-called Sun language theory, that Turkish language is the basic language of all human beings, is the foundation of languages. But these were nationalist projects, and in that thing, he already clearly said we have to go before Islam, like the Shah in Iran, in order to establish our national consciousness. Islam is an intermediate period, and that he also taught people.
So he was never in kind of Hasan al-Banna. He went into the education line.
If you ask me, no, but I don't believe me. If you find any evidence, it could have been that he had a period or so.
So because I thought that, well, along the way he found that, well, I think I would go to the military instead, you know, because instead of bottom up, I think more effective if I go through military and it is from top bottom.
But you know, he went into military schools as a very, very young boy with 12. Also, and then he climbed up in these schools, and there they got this kind of, this was not a secular ideology, but it was this kind of considering Islam more as a kind of cohesive national ideology than as a religion.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah? Yeah, for cohesiveness. And this is actually this French positivist idea, because Émile Durkheim, I mean, he was originally the son of a rabbi from Alsace, Durkheim, and then the rabbi family sent him to Paris, and Paris screwed him up in terms of religion, because he became a complete agnostic in Paris as a student, Durkheim. And then he nevertheless, in this kind of biographical explanation, Durkheim was very much concerned, as many French sociologists, yes, religion disappears, but what makes cohesion then?
Yeah, correct.
If we do not have any more Catholicism, what do we have? Comte thought science could do that, but Durkheim did not, and he said we need something like a religion of humanity, which integrates,
To bind people.
Yeah, to bind people. And C.R. Göckhard took this kind of thing, thought, and he said, no, a modern Islam is precisely providing for us this cohesion. So we need Islam in that sense, but it was not only his previous high leading bureaucrats of the Ottoman Empire also already thought in that direction. And so there, Islam as a integrative kind of set of ideas in the nation building and shaping a cohesive nation. That he comes from that tradition, absolutely. And he, what you can see, he subsequently pushed back the role of Islam. In the first Turkish Republican constitution, there is explicitly written, and Islam is the state religion. And that he abolished in 1928. But from 23 to 28, he used it.
That's why the Said also involved this inside. Because they said, Said agree with him that there's Islamic intelligence, because he abolished it, that's why he removed himself from the government.
But you know, in 23 he needed it because he still had also in Ankara parliament Islamic-minded politicians, and he needed them in establishing his. And then he subsequently marginalized them, and then in 28 he could say, okay, secularism is now established. Explicitly, Islam has been replaced by secularism, and until then also the military officers in 62, when you read the constitution, right in the preamble, this is also when one always in the preamble of the German constitution, you have God. Or in the preamble of the Turkish constitution, you have God is out. You have Nietzsche in this sense. God is dead. You have philosophy of Nietzsche, you have in the preamble of the Turkish constitution, but not in the German.
Yeah, because secular is not about Islam, it's about the religion, right? The separation between the modern and the
No,
religion.
I mean, in Turkey, secular is not, for me, when you ask me what is a secular society, it's not a society without religion. It's a society with religion and with non-religion. But what irony, and it's even more irony, then what has been established in Turkey is an ideology that this country is secularist, that religion should not have any kind of role in this society. And this is a political ideology.
But the idea of religious can be enforced in the political
The
policy. The idea of religious can be put into the political.
Without naming it Islam.
in Turkey, you mean?
In Turkey during
You can use it. I mean, what they have done in the first way was you could not anymore visit the graveyards of saints, and they have forbidden at your face all tariqat and everything.
which was difficult.
But it lived on. It lived on, and what was Menderes important, he could see that you can also use these networks politically, and the Democratic Party got a majority against Inani because the Democratic Party tapped into these religious networks, and therefore later, I mean, I personally think the military stepped in not so much because
not like Egypt.
because of the new mosques and that you could visit the holy places again. But another thing of Menderes was the Menderes government tried to establish political control over the military forces, while under Inani they were inter pares. And Inani was a military officer, Menderes not. And the government tried in the 1950s to change that the military had independent rule of promotion. And now the politicians said, no, politics, civil politicians should be decisive in promotion of military officers, which means we want to have the military subordinated to the electorate, and that was no-go with the officers. So one has to be also careful to what extent secularism and Ataturk was the justification for clearly power interests on the side of the military. And then you have the NATO kind of response saying, okay, do the coup, but democratize immediately afterwards again. So we had that also in 1980. In 1980, when you read Birand, the journalist, he has written an enormously interesting book about the officer coup in September 1980. What did we have? The Iranian Revolution. American and European politicians, they thought, okay, first Iran, now Turkey. That is impossible, that cannot happen. So they said to the officers in meetings, when do you do it? When do you step in? And I mean, one also has to say that the 70s were characterized in Turkey with violent clashes between right-wing, left-wing, religious wings, and Kurdish nationalists. I mean, there was turmoil. So Western politicians said, probably you should do something. Then they have done it, and they said, oh, but you cannot rule with a junta, a NATO member. Now you have to change. You have to start again. And then they started again with democratic politics in about 83, so 3 years after the coup. But they started also to somehow Islamize politics. And you know who was instrumental in the so-called Islamic Turkish synthesis of the 1980s? Erbakan not, he was even in prison at the beginning. A man who is living in the United States today, Fethullah Gülen. Fethullah Gülen was very close to the officers. And this is certainly also not something known in Turkey, where also Erdogan can say the Gülenists in the end are also behind the coup. Because there were these, it was not a visible Islamization of Turkey, but the officers thought the best thing to tackle Kurdish nationalism is Sunni Islam. To make a synthesis that Turkish nationalism is not just Turkish, but is also Sunni Islam. And in the beginning, you might know that the AKP was had a policy much more open. One even started, if I'm correct, to have Kurdish at national schools, Surane Kurmanche, because a part of the Eastern Anatolian electorate of Kurdish origin did not vote for the Kurdish parties, but for AKP, because they considered their identity conception more Sunni than Kurdish. But other political developments have messed up that situation. So the military was not entirely wrong in playing the Islamic card. But as said, social engineering, there are so many screws you try to, and then all of a sudden you lose control. But it also shows that during Republican history, Islam was not entirely out of the picture.
Last thing, do you have a written somewhere we can do a better follow through where to read something about the organized modernism in al-Banna and
I have one book chapter of my newest book in which I write about one chapter is that where I write about diverging poles of Islamic modernism into a secularist kind, and this is this diverging thing. This is not Dietrich's idea. Albert Hourani, the old Oxford professor of the Middle East, he said the interesting thing is that the disciples of Abdu, they either became more and more in the Rida direction, Islamic thinking, Salafis kind of politicians and intellectuals, or they completely secularized. And as Abdel Rasik then wrote this, the caliphate was never a political institution, it was a religious institution. So Hourani already said modernism was important for both sides. And Hourani did never work much about Turkey, and I thought, yes, and actually the Ottoman experience and with Ataturk is the most extreme one of the secularist one. Because Taha Hussein in Egypt, he was a secular thinker. But he said Egypt is more a part of Europe than of the Islamic world, the Mediterranean. But he, in the end, also said, but Islam plays an important role in our culture. So the most extreme one were the radical Kemalists in Turkey. The basic idea is coming from other people, not from me, but there I make that most explicit. And the title is Islamic Modernities in World Society. And then it's one chapter about those two.
It's in English.
It's in English, yes.
So I guess we thank again our presenter today, Professor Dietrich Jung, for
thank you for the invitation.
And this recording is available on Facebook. If you search Ilmuwan Muda IT, so you can find it and re-listen. We are also hosting this as a weekly event, but mostly focusing on contemporary major works that we can discuss. So, but thank you again. Teşekkürler, Dankeschön for the presentation.
Terima kasih.
Yeah.
sama-sama.
Enjoy
But
the
when you have that on Facebook, I should be careful when visiting Egypt the next time. I mean, at the moment, Egypt is a dangerous
Yeah.
terrain for